Hey everyone, welcome to the Catholic Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Fisher. Today we have special guest Brendan Gada from Gotta Be Saints. Before we dive in, this week's question: who's your favorite follow on Instagram right now? Let's bring in Brendan Gada.
Gotcha.
Brendan, how are you doing?
I am doing well. How are you?
Good. Thanks for taking some time to be on the podcast.
Oh,
Tell us a little
thanks.
bit about yourself and about Gotta Be Saints.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Where to begin? In short, I guess, Gotta Be Saints started about 4 years ago as a really an outlet for me. I was before that in the working for the Catholic Diocese of Arlington, did their social media, ran their young adult ministry. And when I left that job, there was a void that I didn't know needed filled, but I realized it shortly after, where I missed being able to share the gospel in a more real and direct way. And the job that I was at the time was still allowing me to share my faith, but not in the same way as the previous one. And so I missed that opportunity. And so from that, for this opportunity to share Gotta Be Saints. And so it started as a social media page, and just a few months later, I launched the podcast. And now it's been about 4 years, and just been a gift for me and hopefully for others to share the gospel. And of course, focusing mostly on this call to be saints. And certainly on the podcast, I share more of that. I feel like those are the conversations. But on the social media side, I'm sharing a lot of saint quotes that are hopefully little bits of inspiration for people who are probably like me and you, who might spend a few minutes every day scrolling their phones. And so I decided, what better way to, offer something on social media than the words and the great wisdom of the saints.
Absolutely. No, I love that. I think what strikes me about your account is just like the consistency of just like simple saint quotes and simple pieces of scripture that are just like so um, unique and just like hard to find. Like it's not like the typical things that you're maybe used to seeing, like the popular quotes. And so it's really cool that you can keep that up. How do you consistently create new things and not like get tired of it or not run out of things to say?
Yeah, I mean, I would say certainly that there are times where I will share something again. But at the same time, our church is so vast. There are so many wonderful men and women that have provided us witnesses of what it means to love and to serve the Lord. And in turn, there are quotes from those saints. You know, many of them, even recently, one of my focus has been 20th century saints and kind of sharing their stories, because, of course, you and I both know Mother Teresa, we know John Paul II, we know Fulton Sheen. You know, we know some of these newer saints, but there are many more that have lived in recent times that their stories haven't been told, or at least not told as widely, and yet they lived these incredible lives. And because of when they were born, uh, we have more information on them. We certainly have more quotes of theirs. For some of them, you know, they're like Jose Maria Escriva, where you can go on YouTube and search and you can watch videos of them, or John Paul II or Mother Teresa, but there are others as well. So it's quite a joy for me too to do the research there. You know, I find myself most of the time, if I'm reading books, they're faith-based books, and I find quotes through that. So it really is, you know, all over, where sometimes it's me searching, but other times I'm just reading something and a quote pops up, or even at times somebody will send me something, a friend or a family member, and that also is wonderful inspiration. And then lastly, I'd say those hours in adoration have always been a huge part of this. I find the Lord inspires me when I'm in prayer, and kind of leads me or directs me to certain quotes to share that are, of course, helpful to me, and then hopefully in turn going to be helpful to somebody else.
Yeah, definitely. What made you choose, Instagram and a podcast, like the outlets that you've chosen to create? Like, take me back to that. Like, were there prior experiences that you had that made you gravitate towards those, or why did you choose that?
Yeah, so I studied communications in college. I was a radio TV major. I initially dreamed of being on ESPN, being on Sports Center, a big sports fan. But when you have a face for radio but not a face for TV, you have to pick your battles. So I decided to, of course, go a different route, or I should say, really, the Lord guided me in a different route. So instead of doing sports, He invited me to serve and work for the church, and of course, I'm thankful for that. But with that being said, social media was an easy place in my mind, and in a podcast as well, because one, I feel like I've always been active on social media. I remember when I had my Facebook when I was in eighth grade. I had Instagram in college, and these two platforms were just easy to use for me. I loved seeing what was going on in my friends' lives, and so I also used them as mediums to share the faith. Especially with Facebook, back when people would make statuses, I would always share saint quotes. And so when it came time to look for a different way to share the gospel, or I guess I should say to share the gospel with people that were outside of my inner circle, it seemed like social media was a perfect place, and the podcast was something that kind of started it all. I felt like I knew many people in my life who had beautiful wisdom to share, and I said I could be the vehicle to sharing that great wisdom. Let me have this opportunity. I'll have a podcast, and through that I can have so and so on, and we can talk about this topic, and maybe, just maybe, it will impact someone in a real way. And so that's kind of where it all started. And then I kind of did a experiment to see if there was actual desire from the people I knew to do this. And so I remember I went on social media and I asked my Facebook friends, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing a podcast. Would any of you support it?" And I didn't ask for a lot of money, but I think I raised over $1,000 within like 2 days, which was at least enough for me to say, I should do this. I should push forward. I should go forward with this, because clearly there's enough people, at least in my corner, who are interested. And hopefully that means there's probably some others. And so the podcast was a natural fit for me. I loved conversations. I loved chatting with people. I think I'm good at being able to draw stuff out of people, kind of being that point guard, passing the ball off and making sure that they're in a spot to be successful. And so that kind of just has been what I've been able to do these last 4 years. And it's just so fun. This as somebody who's hosting your own podcast. You probably love being able to share the different things that but at the same time, to get to converse with these people, I always leave impacted. I walk away from these conversations feeling better, or maybe more specifically, feeling inspired to live a holier life because of the people I'm coming in contact with. And so I guess that's a myriad of reasons for why I do what I do. And I'm just thankful that I get to do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel the same way. I mean, it's been such a journey. Like starting a podcast is a lot of work. How did you? I mean, obviously you got a lot of support right away. People that said this is something that you should do. What did your creative process look like when you started both the content and the podcast? And how does it look now? And like, what are some things you learn along the way that you think others might learn from?
Yeah, I'll say this: you you're never going to be able to have this perfect mapped out plan and then watch it come to completion perfectly. And what I mean by that is, what I envisioned initially was I want to have this space where I interview some people, and I also occasionally have solo podcasts where I share the faith. And that has been constant since I started. So I can at least say, in that realm, what I envisioned for the podcast has been consistent. But that being said, the format, or at least even my expectations for it, has changed a little bit. I can look back at my very first episode, and I really put hours and hours of work into this specific episode. I was planning to do series where I was going to do 5 or 6 episodes on a certain topic, kind of have seasons. And although that was a nice idea, it's not been what I've done. I've instead kind of shifted really into more of a interview podcast where I'm talking to someone on either something they've done or on a specific topic that I find them to be an expert on. And so it's definitely changed gears over the last few years. But that being said, um, the thing that I think has been the thing I'm most proud of and thankful to be able to say is the consistency. I'm in year 4 now of hosting Gotta Be Saints, and in year 3.5 of the podcast. And I've certainly been consistent. There's been stretches where I didn't publish an episode for a couple of weeks, but I'm the first year especially, I did an episode every single week, and that was my goal, and I was consistent with it. And I say that not to brag, but more that I think if someone's in this space, if they're listening to your podcast and they're thinking of either starting a podcast or starting a business or something similar, I want to encourage them to really think about what that looks like. Be open to, you know, working towards that, but at the same time being open to shifting, recognizing things are going to look a little different than what you initially envisioned. But the biggest thing, for me at least, the biggest takeaway has been just, you know, being true to myself and recognizing that although this is hard, as now, you're doing a podcast, you understand that it might only seem like 30 minutes to someone at home. They'll listen and they'll see, oh, cool, this 35, 40-minute podcast. Great. You and I both know there's a ton of extra work in that. Maybe you have someone helping you. For me, I do all the editing. I do all of the, I pull the quotes, I publish, I have to check the copy, all of those things. And I'm happy to do that. For me, this is a labor of love and something I get, a lot of joy out of doing, but it is a lot of work. And I've known multiple people over the last few years, friends of mine even, who started podcasts, and after, less than a year, they stopped. And it wasn't because their idea wasn't good or their desires weren't good. They just came to realize that for them personally, the commitment that it took, what was being asked of them was too much. And so they stopped. And that's not a judgment of them. That's just the reality. So, sorry, that's a really, really long-winded answer, but I think uh, in long, it is something where I can see what I hoped for at the start. I can look at where it is today, and it looks a little different. But I think the biggest thing was the consistency and the recognition and the desire to continue to push forward. And the Lord has blessed it, and He works in that space.
Definitely. You mentioned like adoration being a huge part of, your prayer life and how that kind of boosts your creativity in some senses, as far as like the quotes you might decide to create and post. Um, how has like your prayer life evolved intertwining with Gotta Be Saints? I'm sure like that's how do you like create with the Lord, I guess? 'Cause that's something I've been praying about a lot. How does that look for you?
Yeah, so I'll start with where I was 4 years ago, and I'll finish with where I am today. 4 years ago, I was a single person. I was living in Cincinnati, Ohio. I lived 5 minutes from a local adoration chapel, and I had all this free time. It was, in a certain sense, it was wonderful. I had a huge desire to be a married man, but I knew that God had a plan, and I trusted that. And so when I first created this apostolate, I truly had all the time in the world. I'd get done working, and this would oftentimes be my first priority. I didn't have any other obligations, really. And it also coincided with COVID. So when I was first getting underway, it was COVID. So I was at my house anyway. And excuse me, there was really, 3 things that I was consistent with, or I should say 4 things. I was consistent with uh, doing my work, my job to pay the bills, and then I focused on exercise. I focused on going to mass every day, and I focused on prayer. And those 4 things were a part of my life in a very real way. Um, when it came to prayer, I, in college, found myself challenged by a friend to make daily prayer a part of my life. And it was in that moment that, I my prayer life blossomed. I'll just leave it at that. And so years later, fast forward to when I'm creating this podcast and this ministry and this apostolate, prayer was and had to be at the forefront. And so I found myself having a lot of free time, and I would go up to our local adoration chapel and I would just spend hours with the Lord. And I remember, this isn't to make me sound sad or holy, whichever way somebody might interpret it, but I remember Friday evenings not having anything to do. And so I spent those Friday evenings in the adoration chapel, and 1 hour might lead to 2 hours. I would just be up there and I would be reading, but I'd also just be praying. And I have always been a big fan of journaling as well. So I would just be writing things down. And it was in those hours spent that I found myself really just reflecting on the whole human person, because I was looking at my own life, of course, through the lens of my own life, the different things that I was going through, I was struggling with, or the joys, as well. And I recognized that so many other people were going through the same things, especially in that single life. I found that a bunch of the people in the Gotta Be Saints community were in that same spot. They were single and they were longing for their vocation, and yet recognizing that God had invited them into this other period of life and they needed to embrace it. And so for myself, I said, let's be somebody who embraces this, and hopefully that inspires some others. And then, of course, as time went on, I met my now spouse, and Gotta Be Saints continued on, but now I was in a different season, so I was sharing more of probably the joys of life, which came with dating and then engagement and now marriage. And so all throughout that, I think there has been different things that have happened in my life that I've then shared with my audience. I got to share dating. I've been able to share marriage. My wife and I miscarried a few months ago. I've been able to share that, which is just a real part of life that certain people experience. And so through all of this, I think God has been just ever present. And the thing that I recognize, excuse me, that has had to remain is that prayer life, and I'll admit to you that what Gotta Be Saints looks like today is probably a little different than what it looked like 2 years ago. Even the posts, I think I used to share a lot more personal stories, or I would be more inclined to write a long message to accompany a quote or reflection that I had in the chapel. My prayer life looks different today than it once did. I don't get to pray as much as I used to, and recognizing that's my vocation is to my wife, my spouse. So I understand that prayer is going to look different. But being able to always let the Holy Spirit be present in it. And then in long, lastly, this has gone into the podcast. Although I don't get to write as much, I still get to have these conversations. And so I oftentimes, find myself at peace knowing that if someone wants to, hear a little bit more of what's really going on in my personal life and those things that I have to share, they can go to the podcast. And although that audience is much smaller, I feel like I've been blessed to hear from many people who have encountered blessings from those episodes, especially the ones where I'm, talking to other people, because I think it's good for others to hear, the voices of other people, especially those who don't have platforms, but have this beautiful wisdom, which I'm sure you feel blessed just like me that many of those people, or at least have in, interviewed many of those people, and then you get to share, their insights, which is just the beauty of our faith.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's beautiful to hear how that kind of all came about. Um, what are some of the challenges you face with being someone who creates on social media, who creates a podcast, but also like I don't know about you, but like I feel like I like social media. I like using it as a platform for good, but I also struggle sometimes with. There's also like the addictive part of social media, like finding that balance. Like, what have you found works for you, or like what challenges have you faced in that?
Yeah, I'll be the first to admit I don't know if I've necessarily got it um, down perfectly. I mean, what I'll do, so I have a personal Instagram, that's my own. I'll oftentimes not go on that for a while because that's the one I'm more inclined to sit and scroll and look at, just because those are the people that I know very personally. And so when they're posting stuff, I want to click through and watch all their stories and whatnot. Um, but I think it's also just discernment of, what is it doing in your life? So for me, I recognize sometimes it distracts me during my workday. So I need to always be, prudent in that. And then I need to think about, after hours. My wife and I are, I think, pretty good about not letting our phones consume us. At the same time, there are definitely moments where I can look and see, I should have probably just put my phone away. And I am addicted to my phone to some degree, and I recognize that. I can think of, if I'm going to bed and my wife and I are chatting and then we stop talking, there's that first desire, oh, I should go grab my phone. So I think each person just has to be aware of their own personal attachment to these things, and then do what they can to, kind of uproot that. It's difficult, it's a challenge. And I think using social media in a positive way, probably to some degree, has almost allowed me to give myself a pass, which, is not good. And I recognize that, it's definitely something that I struggle with time and time again. But I also think that, at least personally, I usually have come to the conclusion, or I have come to the conclusion that, at least in this season currently today, like what I'm being asked of is to continue to use it. And so my only prayer there is, if this takes away from my salvation or puts that, in dire straits, then I pray that I have the humility to walk away. And if not, then I pray that I use it well. So I think that's my prayer. That's my desire. I don't get it right all the time. I'll be the first to admit it. And I'm thankful I have my wife to keep me in check and just challenge me to be the man that I'm supposed to be. And of course my friends and family as well.
Definitely, I think that's beautiful. Yeah, what's been like the coolest thing that's happened to you since starting Gotta Be Saints? Do you have any cool stories of like just encounters or things that happened or came about because of this whole journey?
Yeah, I think there's been numerous. There's one person that just came to my mind, a girl who reached out to me months and months ago, just asking for prayers. Her husband and her were pregnant and had some complications with the pregnancy, and to be able to be there with her through that, somebody I didn't know, was beautiful. And they ended up sadly losing the baby, but it only made it actually was beautiful because only months later, my wife and I lost our little girl, Eden, and I was able to share that with her and ask for her prayers. Um, in terms of a more light story, I this was just funny to me. I was in Rome with my wife last March, and I'll be the first to admit that I my wife likes to tease me, and some of my friends like to say, "Oh, you have a popular social media, you're an influencer." And I'm the first person to say, "No, I'm not. Thank you." But we were in Rome in a park that was like on the outskirts of town, and somebody recognized me, which I just thought was hysterical. And luckily, my wife wasn't with me because she would have just given me so much crap. But this guy just came up to me and goes, "Hey, are you Brendan from Gotta Be Saints?" And I was like, "I'm in Rome in a random park. How is this happening?" But it happened to be an American who just happened to be over there and apparently followed the page. And so there's been little things like that. I'm always, I think, it's always a joy to hear from people that I know, who have been impacted by some of this stuff. I think for me at least, I always think of, how Jesus talks about when he goes to his native place, and, just how difficult it is for those people who actually know the person for Jesus, they were like, how can this be? We know him. He's the carpenter's son. I'm not comparing myself to Jesus here, but what I am saying is it's funny because I mean I've got multiple friends who know that I do this page and they don't follow it, and I don't. That doesn't offend me, but I'd probably be similar where there'd be certain people I'd be like, yeah, I want to follow along their journey, and others where I'd be like, I know that person too well. I don't think I want to engage with this. And so I will say it's always humbling if somebody I'm close to um, reaches out about something that I've posted or shared, or a conversation I've had. Um, but yeah, really, I think of that woman who reached out to me, but I think it's just anytime I open my messages, I feel like I'm touched a lot by just the people people who have been impacted by something, and that I get to be those hands and feet just in the smallest of ways.
Definitely. What's your piece of advice to others that want to use social media for good to spread the gospel, and share maybe their story or share the gospel in their own unique way through social media? And maybe they're already doing it. Maybe they want to get started. What's your piece of advice to them?
Yeah, I would say be yourself, and ask yourself, the why. Why do you want to do this? And if what you're doing is been given to you or is preordained by God, or at least inspired by that, then he's going to make it work, and he's going to give you a path forward. I always ask myself this question when I was in uh, college. I think someone asked me, when we were talking about my first job outside of college, and they had the great quote to me. They said, well, what's going to call you to love the most? And that's always stuck with me. So anytime I do anything, at least anything of somewhat importance, I like to ask myself that question: what is going to call me to love the most? And then act on that. And so when it comes to social media, if someone's feeling inspired to share the gospel in this way, I say, push forward, do that. And then as time goes on, keep asking yourself, like, is this calling me to love the most? Am I the best version of myself in this space? Am I being used well? Is it bringing maybe others to holiness, but is it bringing me closer to God? And if so, if you can answer yes to that question or those questions, then I say keep pushing forward. But, you know, the big thing that I think I've heard from certain people over time, that I always want them to be weary of, or I feel, inclined to share, is do not base what you do on the numbers, because it's so easy to look and say, I have 300 followers, I have 3,000 followers, or I've got, XYZ, I don't care, whatever the number is, and then base your worth or your presence or your importance on those numbers. I just think that's not from the Lord. That's from the devil. He wants you to make it a numbers game. He wants you to be, in this battle or comparison. And I'm guilty of it myself. So I share that, fully knowing that that struggle is real and can be real, and when you're in that, just kind of remember that it's not from him, and really send it to the foot of the cross. Say, Lord, help me, so that I don't have this comparison, and then just go from there. But if you find peace, if the Lord is drawing you out of yourself and into helping others, I think that's the best place to be, in whatever way, if it be through social media or if it be through a myriad of other ways. But the Lord just wants to use us, and we just have to be open.
Absolutely. I love that. I think that's great advice. Um, for all listeners, where can they find you, and follow what you're doing to keep up with all your projects?
I would say the biggest one is Instagram. That's Gotta Be Saints. But at the same time, if you're on Facebook, we're on there. It's at Gotta Be Saints. If you want to listen to the podcast, Gotta Be Saints on Apple, Spotify, wherever you can get your podcasts. But pretty straightforward.
Awesome. Brendan, thanks so much for taking the time to be on. Really appreciate the conversation. Learned lots from you today. And best of luck in your future endeavors. And just thank you for all you do in your ministry. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mitch. It's been a gift.
God bless. Take
God
care.
bless. Have a great day.